So DEXs finally got access to the testnet, and the next thing you knew, a million Ethereum maximalists were all screaming about something called concurrency issues. Here's why Cardano actually doesn't care and won't lose even a wink of sleep over it. Ready? Let's go. We covered these exact concurrency issues in detail in episode number 111, which was exactly 2 months ago today. So go back and watch that if you don't understand how these concurrency issues work. Today we'll discuss why exactly 2 months later, they're still not a problem. 2 months ago, I offered that if you are becoming involved in Cardano DeFi projects, especially DEXs, if you felt like you were a supporter of those projects, even if only, sort of a morale type supporter, you probably should be asking yourself whether it seems like the project you're supporting is a project that has a game plan for dealing with concurrency issues. When I made that video 2 months ago, we already knew that this was going to be one of those technical thresholds that projects would have to pass in order to see any kind of realistic use of their products. And at that time, it already kind of looked like Ergo had figured out a way to handle this. In that video, I also covered this article by Occam. This is the same original article by Occam that Charles referenced in his video today. You might remember this is the video where they gave the analogy of Coke machines servicing customers to explain concurrency. This article gave us a good idea that Occam had already wrapped their head around this concurrency problem, and they were working on it. That instinct turned out to be well-founded on August 17th when Occam released this press release where they announced that their developer team, who were participants in the Plutus Pioneer program, had now found and implemented a novel and entirely decentralized solution to the concurrency challenge. In case you're curious, Occam is describing their solution as an intra-block slot auction system. We've also seen other assorted posts from various groups. Here's one from Maladex where they say straight up, Maladex, full steam, on course, concurrency issue solved. This is kind of what we expected 2 months ago. In any distributed system, you have to deal with the existence of concurrent users. And the architectures that help manage those concurrent users in an account balance system are probably going to end up being different than the ones that work in a UTxO system. So unsurprisingly, the people that are trying to employ those account balance architectures over on Cardano are finding a difficult path, whereas people who are thinking about it with fresh minds and coming up with novel new architectures are finding luck, as we can see from their reports as to how they're doing on the concurrency issues. This shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, Charles said it in this video today. Smart contracts on a UTxO system are the solution to a problem that Satoshi couldn't solve. That's why Bitcoin doesn't have smart contracts. Also not a surprise that the things that worked on the old system, smart contracts on an account balance system, don't necessarily work on this new system of smart contracts on UTxO. We have to create new things that work with smart contracts on UTxO. In his video today, Charles detailed how there are going to be multiple solutions to this problem with varying degrees of sophistication as we go down the timeline. And it seems like the ones that are going to be most apparent right now are probably off-chain concurrent state machines, sidechains, and distributed UTxOs, all of which might present opportunities for projects to surmount this hurdle with ease. The more important point here, though, may have been lost on a lot of viewers. Cardano never actually departed from their original conception that a blockchain should be multi-layered with distinct but interoperative settlement and computation layers. I remember this was one of the, maybe like the very first things I learned about Cardano way back in the day, even before I'd bought any ADA. There would be a CSL and a CCL. It was almost like little buzz terms. I think around that time, you couldn't even really get into a conversation online about Cardano without somebody throwing around the buzz terms. And those were like the buzz terms that everybody knew. There would be a Cardano settlement layer and a Cardano computation layer, CSL and CCL. That nomenclature hasn't been used as much in recent years, but that conception of the blockchain never went away. And it kind of came back here with Charles explaining what the Cardano computation layer might actually look like. And it would take on a bunch of different forms. So you're probably thinking to yourself, wait a second. Now you're saying we have to have a computation layer and a settlement layer. Isn't the whole point that everything just happens on layer one, like in Ethereum? Guess what? Ethereum DeFi never really worked on layer one either. It was always broken by an inability to scale on layer one with non-absurd fees. And in fact, Ethereum 2.0 isn't really going to work on layer one either. There's going to be layer one, but then there's going to be a lot of stuff happening and being reincorporated in layer one through ZK rollups, zero knowledge rollups. And this is something we find with every single large market cap, decentralized, high value blockchain. They all seem to do this. They all have layer twos. Bitcoin doesn't even have computation, and layer two, the Lightning Network, is basically the only thing Bitcoin maximalists want to talk about. That's like their big area of focus. Like I just said, ETH is also going to use ZK rollups with their layer two, since they haven't figured out sharding with their global state yet. Or at least as I look at their documentation, it appears to me like they are struggling to figure out how to do sharding with global state, which is exactly why Cardano does not have global state. It really looks like layer two solutions are probably going to be a part of any blockchain that is making a good and honest run at solving the blockchain trilemma. We've covered the blockchain trilemma many, many times, but this is the idea that you have three different properties, and it's very difficult to maximize all of them at the same time. You have security, decentralization, and scaling. And it's pretty easy to do something like Binance Smart Chain, where you have no decentralization. It's pretty easy to max out scaling and surpass something like Ethereum. And it's also easy to have decentralization and a lot of scalability and no security. But it's very difficult to maximize all three. And in fact, this is the base rationale for my bet on Cardano as the blockchain that will create the most value in the crypto space. Because my original bet clear back in that 2017, 2018 timeframe was that they were doing the best job of balancing those three factors. And it looks like any blockchain that is also trying to solve the blockchain trilemma is doing so with these types of layer two solutions. But it's not as simple as Bitcoin Lightning Network. What Charles is talking about in this video, as you can kind of tell from this diagram, is much more sophisticated and nuanced. And there are different types of layer twos. It's not just these dedicated channels like in the Lightning Network. The cool thing for us is that Cardano was built from the ground up, from the very beginning, to include these types of solutions, while other chains are sort of just figuring out right now that they need to build for this too. In fact, in this video today, Charles let us in on the little code name that IOHK has for some of their sidechain work. That's Mamba. And he mentioned that they're actually working on a sidechain where you could run an OBFT chain, that's an Ouroboros Byzantine fault tolerance chain, at very high speed with a trusted subset of SPOs. We ran on OBFT in between Byron and Shelley. You might remember that hard fork from, when was it, last year or the year before, as sort of an intermediate step. We don't necessarily want OBFT at our base layer because it requires a trusted quorum. It would be subject to things similar to a 51% attack if you don't have a trusted quorum, if malicious actors gained access to more than 51% of the block validation. But if it's a side chain, so you don't want that for your base layer, but if it's a side chain, you could run at very high speeds and everybody will just know this is a side chain that runs at very high transactions per second. And this is not a trustless sidechain. We're actually just trusting this little subset of SPOs. They're trusted SPOs. You'll remember earlier this week, we talked about sidechains in the context of DC Spark's Milkomeda project. Still uncertain exactly how that's supposed to be pronounced. But in that project, they're going to run Ethereum virtual machine sidechain so that developers from Ethereum can come over, run their smart contracts on that sidechain, and we'll all have access to them as ADA users. There'll be wrapped smart contracts and wrapped ADA, but they'll be able to run their Solidity smart contracts. This is really interesting because Charles and IOHK have also been putting a lot of thought into sidechains. And in fact, he mentioned the DC Spark project. But he also said, hey, you can run any kind of sidechain you want. In fact, we could run a Plutus sidechain. You could have something just like Milkomeda sidechain, except instead of running in Solidity, it's a Plutus sidechain of Ouroboros Plutus mainnet. So you could have a Plutus sidechain of a Plutus main chain, but you could run it with a much faster transactions per second if you went with something like OBFT. Obviously, there are going to be various different types of sidechains that can solve that concurrency problem, including the virtual machine one. I mean, the Ethereum virtual machine one, it's going to run Ethereum Solidity, which can tackle the concurrency issues in a different way because it's account balance as opposed to being UTxO. And what we see is that all the blockchain projects that are running smart contracts are sort of gravitating towards decentralization at the base layer as much as they can achieve and scaling on the L2s and sidechains with varying levels of sacrifice of decentralization on those L2s and sidechains. This is kind of what Hydra will be. Hydra will obviously have different properties as to decentralization versus the mainnet. It's going to be more centralized. Right? That's how these layer twos typically work. But don't forget, Cardano has this giant advantage with Hydra in that Plutus smart contracts will be able to run on Hydra just like they do on the mainnet. That's a piece that a lot of these blockchains leave out when they're talking about their layer two solutions. They fail to mention a lot of times that the same smart contracts that run on their base layer may not be able to run on their layer two solution without some modification. In Cardano, that's not the case. In Cardano, those same smart contracts, those same Plutus smart contracts can run on layer two just like they can on the mainnet. That may seem like a small distinction right now when blockchain is still kind of this niche thing, especially smart contracts on blockchains. But it becomes a gigantic advantage for Cardano once we get to those upper levels of scaling, those really high TPS levels where L2 is necessary and not just a novel bonus. So what's the upshot here? The upshot is that your favorite DEX that you've been supporting all this time may or may not be able to run on the 12th. It depends on whether or not the developers of that DEX were able to figure out a new novel way for concurrency to work in a UTxO system. If they try to tackle it the same way you tackle it in an account balance system, they may not yet know how to manage concurrency in a UTxO system. And those solutions are going to be the only ones that are going to work on the 12th. This is something else we've talked about on this channel. The 12th is just the beginning of a new stage. And a lot of the DApp experiences you might be able to have on the 12th are probably going to be very underwhelming compared to what they will look like in a mature ecosystem that's been around for years. Those developers who haven't quite figured out how to handle concurrency are going to cry about it because they wanted to make a bunch of money somehow. Probably, and I'm not saying this is everybody, but I'm going to say the vast majority of people developing dApps are trying to make some money, especially when it comes to DeFi dApps. They're trying to make a bunch of money somehow. And they're going to be pretty sad when they realize that their account balance based conception of how concurrency works actually does not translate very well into the UTxO world. I'm going to be really straight up here, though. That whole game plan that goes, I'm going to become a DeFi developer and develop a decentralized exchange and make a bunch of money on it. That whole game plan may have always been illusory. It may have always been an illusion. And the SEC made that very clear yet again on Friday. Gary Gensler, the head of the SEC, has been putting the signal out for a long time. He doesn't think these decentralized finance projects are actually decentralized. And the reason he thinks that is because the developers, they always figure out some, even if it's kind of obscured and hidden, there's always some way in which they're guaranteeing some remuneration for themselves. There's always some governance token that somehow entitles them to some kind of a revenue flow, or that's going to develop a secondary market and they can trade governance tokens they've retained into the secondary market. People develop these projects because they want to make money, and they always retain some way to make money. And that's where Gary Gensler is going to go after them, because it's seldom the case that someone develops a DeFi project, it turns out to be a really good one, they push it out in the world, and it's like the Satoshi scenario where they seem to never make any money on it. They just push it out there to be cool, and they never make any money. That's not the majority of the developers. Most of the developers doing this are trying to get rich. So they keep some way to make a lot of money on the DeFi project, and that's where the SEC is going to go after them. They're going after Uniswap. Uniswap was thought to be untouchable by a lot of people. And even today on Twitter, you're going to see a lot of Ethereum maximalists telling you there's nothing to worry about. The SEC is just investigating Uniswap. That's no big deal. They're probably going to do nothing. It'll be a slight slap on the wrist. This is a signal. They're going after one of the most well-known, most prominent DeFi projects to let the entire DeFi space know that no one is safe. That if you have created a DeFi project and you've retained some way to make a bunch of money on it, they're not really going to view it as decentralized. They're not going to view it the same as you just pushing some code out there so you can claim that this is like a free speech issue. Like, I just wrote some code. It's free speech. It's okay for me to publish this code. That's not really what a lot of these developers do. They don't just publish this code as a free speech issue to enlighten the world as to a new software structure. They push some code out there and they figure out some way to make a bunch of money on it. The SEC is not going to let you make money off an unregistered securities exchange. There's no two ways about it. If you are creating something that is going to be an unregistered securities exchange, they're not going to let you make money off it. And a lot of people are trying to create this red herring in social media today, saying that, pretending like it's more of a straw man argument, really, pretending like the SEC is going after Uniswap because of their airdrop of their token. There's that. And there's also the fact that it's a big old exchange and there's a bunch of tokens on it. Uniswap Labs had their own interface for the Uniswap protocol, and they delisted a whole bunch of tokens from their interface. But the SEC, Gary Gensler, the head of the SEC, has already said that if you're trading a whole bunch of tokens, chances are there's some securities in there. And I think, actually, truth be known, if you could get the truth out of Gary Gensler, he'd probably say that the vast majority of tokens being traded on DEXs are actually securities. He's agreed in the past with prior SEC personnel speeches where they said that there was one famous one where someone from the SEC leadership said that every single token he had ever seen was a security. And Gary Gensler has sort of agreed with that sentiment. They are very possibly going to say that you are the centralized perpetrator behind an unregistered securities exchange. If Americans are trading on your DEX at all, we already know from the BitMEX case that they don't even care if you screen for American IPs because they're gonna assume that Americans are using VPNs to get past your IP screening. It's not just DEXs either. It's a lot of other types of DeFi we have going on. Gary Gensler, in particular, keeps bringing up synthetics. We've also seen that projects like BlockFi have been attacked by state securities regulators in a lot of different states. And the thing is, the fact that BlockFi is centralized may not distinguish it from its air quotes decentralized loan counterparts, crypto loan counterparts, because again, the SEC is just going to come to you and say, hey, I notice you say this is decentralized, yet you're going to end up making a bunch of money on it because of whatever it is you're doing, probably a governance token or something like that, or, tokens in a DAO or something like that. There's some way that most of these developers are figuring out how to make money on these so-called decentralized projects. The SEC is going to say that is not decentralized. They're going to say that you are the centralized perpetrator behind an unregistered blank. This is just another reason why the Cardano community shouldn't care too much about these concurrency issues. It may be that the SEC is just about to flatten all of the DeFi activity. Concurrency is obviously really important for things like DEXs and maybe a lot of other DeFi platforms. But there are a lot of things in crypto, in Cardano, that can be developed that don't require such an emphasis on concurrency. And we might be about to experience this big flip where a lot of the activity in crypto is focused on DeFi right now. But if that gets flattened by the SEC, we may see a big unwinding where everybody's scrambling to move from DeFi to other types of crypto projects. So I think there are some obviously some solutions already in place for concurrency. It looks like there are a bunch of ways that concurrency can be solved in the future. And it may be that concurrency is not as important as people think it is, because maybe DeFi is not as important as people think it is for regulatory reasons. Talk to you tomorrow.